2016, a small coding mistake costed me $5,000. That mistake was committing my server keys. Since then, I've vowed to prevent anyone else from making that mistake by teaching about environment variables. Welcome to Scaling Your JavaScript Configuration. My name is Kemal Ahmed, and a software engineer from Toronto, Canada. This course is going to be very helpful for intermediate to advanced JavaScript developers learning how to set up projects to be scalable, configurable, secure, and production-ready in team settings. Current users of environment variables will also benefit from the course because we dive deep into the industry standard practices for most types of JavaScript projects. We'll cover backend, frontend, webpack, and more. Each lesson in the course will build on the last. We'll configure servers, build automated tests, and deploy to the real world. I'm very excited to teach this course. This is my first course I've ever taught. I'm also the owner and maintainer of the react-native-dotenv module, so we'll be going over that library in detail. Some things you should know before taking this course include JavaScript syntax, Node.js, and the basics of Git. The star of this course is an NPM library called .env, which facilitates the principles of the 12-factor app. I won't expand on what the principles are in this course because memorizing each of the 12 factors won't help you get a job. Instead, I'll show you how to do it. Environment variables and .env files are also used in many other coding languages such as Python, PHP, Ruby, and more. So it is not just about some small JavaScript library, but rather a pattern ubiquitous across many levels of professional developers. Now that you know what we're doing here, let's figure out when these patterns will apply. If you write your bank password down on a piece of paper and fold it up, you're exercising security by obscurity, which can be effective, but it's not recommended. This is the justification I used the last time I committed sensitive information to my code repository. In just 2 minutes of my code accidentally being public and less than 8 hours when I went to sleep is all it took for hackers to abuse my AWS keys. What could I have done to prevent the AWS keys from being exposed? Even if I removed the keys from my code, I'd have had to wipe the entire code history to make sure it wasn't in any of the commits. But exposure can come in different forms. Even if your project is private, when you share the repo with a new contributor, such as a contractor who should not have production keys, you're exposed. Okay, let's back it up a second. What are we talking about when we say keys? How does this relate to environment variables? When building production-grade projects that communicate with servers over the internet, you have to have secure ways to authorize access to these servers. This course uses environment variables to solve the problem of securely configuring instances of a running Node.js server. There could be other solutions, but we're going to focus on why the industry standard is to use environment variables. Let's call them EVs for now because environment variables is a mouthful. EVs and .env files are also used in many other programming languages, such as Python, Java, Ruby, and more. So it's not just about some small JavaScript library, but rather a pattern used by many types of professional developers. Okay, so we know we need to configure server keys. What are some other reasons to use EVs? Sometimes URLs need to be configured. Do you have a database URL? Which backend are you pointing to? Do you have an internal server for testing or what folks call UAT? Are there specific user databases you're using for development? You need to be able to change these securely as needed. How about less secure things like turning features on and off? Should your feature only be available on beta instances? Are you turning on and off diagnostic tools for development that would otherwise hinder the user experience? EVs make it easy to manage configurations for different types of environments, whether it's a test, prod, proof of concept, or local. They're called environment variables because they're read from the command line environment and not from code. They can be injected into the environment at runtime, so lots of tools that build support them, especially tools for automatic deployment, also known as continuous integration tools. The support from these tools make EVs an essential skill to have for building production-ready projects. Before we go into code, let's clarify what configurations are not relevant to EVs. I like to use the jargon instance-specific, but I know this is going to confuse a lot of people, so let me explain. Every time a server is run, it creates an individual instance with its own configuration. If you're using a managed server cloud like Lambda or Netlify, you probably have one configuration set that will be the same for all servers. This would be a service instance. If you start a server on your own computer for local testing, you'll use a different configuration than when you go to deploy your code onto your server in production. EV configuration is not user-specific configuration. It's not saving user preferences. It's not admin versus regular users. It's stuff that applies to all users that connect to that instance. It's until that server is shut down and the configuration changed or a new server is spun up, user data comes from data APIs and different data coming back does not change the EVs. It's not for changing an interface based on the data, like how some YouTube videos have up to 1080p and some have 8K. That is information that comes from the server network calls, and the interface code doesn't change, although the interface does adapt to the data. It's also not for device-specific stuff, like responsive design, where if you open an app from your phone, you'll have a different experience as from your laptop because the code stays the same and the interface is as adaptive to the device. EVs are also not for changing the package.json, so they cannot affect the version of JavaScript or Node.js the project is using. Lastly, when EVs work, when are EVs not helpful? EVs probably would not be as helpful to single-person teams if you're not using Git or if you're manually deploying through file transfer protocol. If you're coding JavaScript without Node, such as for static HTML websites, when you're not using a bundler, you're not going to be even able to use EVs. Of this lesson is to demonstrate how to use environment variables by setting up a basic Node server script. We're going to be starting off with an empty Node script. To access environment variables, you use the object process.env. To start, the most important environment variable is node.env, which we access through process.env.node.env. This is used to hold the name of the configuration set you're currently using. Most frameworks interface with it in some way. Let's see what that looks like by console logging it. To do that, first we're going to add a start script, node index.js, and then let's run that. We'll do npm run start, and we'll notice it's undefined. That's because it has to be set. So how do we set it? The way to set it is when you run the script, you have to enter it into the environment. In this case, we can use node.env equals something like development, and when we rerun that, it prints development. The first exercise we're going to do is to use node.env for a CORS check like that on a backend server. To those of you who don't know what a CORS check is, it's a commonly used security feature on Node.js backend servers that can make it difficult to do local testing if left on. It's not that important to the course. If we want to serve to all domains for some values of node-env and only to one domain for production, we can use a blurb like this, where we exclusively serve to localhost when node-env equals production and to all domains every other time. Just to make sure this was working, let's show what happens when we print that. So npm run start, we have our value being development, and when we set it to production, it says exclusively serves to localhost. But what happens when we want to set which domain that we're going to be serving to? We have to use an environment variable to set the value here. Instead of localhost, we can set it to another environment variable. In this case, I'm going to call it process.env.serverURL. But how can we set so many variables on the command line? It gets really long. I mean, yes, we can use the and character server URL, but this gets very difficult and confusing to use. So let's not do this. Instead, we're going to get our configuration from a file, and that file is usually called a .env file. So I just created a .env file. Notice that there's no extensions, there's nothing before the .env. That is the extension, it's a plain text file. And we can use this file to set the server URL value, server_URL equals, so let's keep it at localhost for now, and we'll change it in a little bit. In fact, to be more realistic, we'll make it a proper URL, port 3000. Unfortunately, Node can't access this file out of the box. We have to use an npm library, which is .env. The way to use it is to require .env, and then we use the configuration function, config. And so when we run that function, npm run start, you'll notice it says exclusively serves to localhost 3000. Great. Before we continue, let's look at how .env files are structured. They're pretty flexible, but I like to use them like this because they're constants. Every variable in .env in environment variables are constants. So the convention is to use uppercase with underscore cased or snake cased, but it is case sensitive if you do want to change that up. The values can contain spaces after the equal signs, but I really discourage it. I don't use that. And the values are always strings. They're always strings, all the time. There is a lint plugin if you're wondering, and I've linked it in the description, as well as a few other rules that I advise you follow for how to use .env files. So wait, if everything in environment variables is a string, what if we have numbers or booleans that we're trying to bring into our project? Well, for numbers, you're going to have to set it to an interim variable and parse it. But for boolean values, it's a little bit harder. To demonstrate, I'm going to add another variable. We'll call it useCores. So again, yeah, we're doing the useCores example. And by default, we don't want to use it. We'll say equals false. And we'll say if process.env.useCores equals, well, in this case, we have to choose between true, like the string true, and false, because the default value of an environment variable is actually undefined. So if no value is set, it's actually going to be undefined, and we have to use that thinking to determine which value we're going to check for. The thing is that we don't want to check for the default value because it could actually be undefined. So in this case, we'll check for true. So if the value is not set, or if it is false, then it will do the default action, which is serve to all actions, the domains, and otherwise only specifically if use course is set to true will it exclusively serve to the server URL. So what happens if we want to put our .env file in a custom folder, like a config folder? Well, let's try it. We'll create a config folder, and we'll move the .env file into the config folder. Now what we have to do is use the path library so that way we can access this. So first, we'll import the path library, and then instead of having config empty, what we can do is we can specify the path in which the .env file is loaded from. In this case, it's in the config folder and it's called .env. You can rename this, but you probably shouldn't. Well, we're going to talk about that in a later module. For now, I'm going to take it out of there because this isn't something that I recommend. I recommend that before you use a new framework that you look at the various environment variables that are paired with that framework. One other piece of advice is that someone asked me what happens when .env updates. Well, the format of .env is a standard that's been around for a long time. It's a standard across multiple languages, operating systems. I don't expect this to change anytime soon, and the skills that you learn in this course are going to help you in other languages. Lastly, setting node-env equals production. This is a Unix only thing. So if you do have a team that is cross OS, you may need to use other techniques. Sometimes I just have a second function, a second script that's like node set node-env equals production and node-index.js. But you can also use some libraries like crossenv, but though crossenv is very old and deprecated, so that's why I'm not showing it in this video. Environment. What if you also want to do automated testing or test your production environment at your own machine? What do you do when you have multiple sets of configurations? In 1.2, we're going to talk about when, why, and how to handle this using a technique called .env flow. So what is .env flow? It's a strategy to determine which version of a variable to use when you have multiple configuration sets. It's actually featured in numerous front-end toolchains, but also has a standalone library, which is what I'll be demonstrating today. As you can see, we're picking up from the end of the last lesson, and we're going to actually go ahead and show you how to use it. First thing I'm going to do is actually install it. So you actually use this instead of .env. So you'd first uninstall .env, and then you would install .env-flow. You also configure it in almost exactly the same way. Where it says require .env.config, you just say .env-flow.config, and it actually runs the same. Next thing I'm going to do is make a copy of my .env, so we now have two configuration sets. I'm actually going to put at the end of the file .env.production. The way it works is when the value of node-env matches the suffix of .env.whatever, that file is chosen. In this case, I only have the copy production. The standard environment names are test, production, and development. It's best to use these built-in environment names that Flow provides because it's a convention that many libraries use, such as Jest, Babel, etc. And we'll go through those two in a bit. I've linked to the Flow hierarchy documentation in the lesson docs below. However, you can technically use any name that you want. So the way to take advantage of multiple configuration sets is, of course, to have multiple different sets. So for now, I'm going to show you how this works. We have a use CORS value in our .env. So in our .env.production, I'm going to set the value to true. I'm not going to change the server URL for now, and that's okay. We'll circle back to that. Next thing that I'll do is I'll go to my package.json and make sure that there's two start scripts, one for production and one that's just without any node-env value being set. Now let's see the difference and see what happens. npm run start. So that says undefined, served to all domains, which means that the use CORS is off. And then we'll do npm run start production. And it says exclusively served to localhost. One problem with this approach is you may want to check in standard variables to Git, like the use CORS, and not instance specific variables like the server URL. What you can do is you can create a .env.local. So instead of overwriting it here, I'll make a copy of .env, call it .env.local, and I'll keep the server URL value and remove it from .env.production. This is a secure way to specify these local values because it's never supposed to be checked into Git. Make sure you add it to your git ignore. env.star.local. .env.local. .local takes even higher precedence than .env. So even if you have values set in your .env or your .env.production, the .local will overwrite that. You can also use a second .local that is .env.production.local. Although I'm not sure that's too necessary, it gets a bit complicated, but it is a feature that you can use. We're not going to use that for this demo. Some of you are probably finding this whole flow process a little bit tedious and complicated. So let me explain why having multiple layers is useful. It isn't actually always useful. It isn't always helpful. I'd say there's only about two types of situations which it would help with. And for this lesson, let's call them A and B. A is for defaults. If you have default values that aren't secrets that you want to keep in your .env file and plan on checking .env into Git, Flow would allow you to use the .env.local for setting the values of secrets during development. In production, you'll still be able to set the environment values through the dashboards of your automated deployments, which we'll go over in Module 2. It can also be useful if you have a lot of non-secret configuration values that differ between development and production, such as toggling a set of features for a beta environment. If you don't have multiple sets of defaults and you're doing automated deployments, you can already set environment variable values without .env flow by setting the values in your .env file for local testing, keeping it in .gitignore, and then for production, setting the real values through your deployment dashboard. Your secrets must not be checked in, so you will already have to set them wherever your code is being deployed, and you can toggle features through the same dashboard. And type B is for local deployment. It's useful if you're generating bundles for deployment on your workstation, such as for Lambdas or frontends, or mobile apps where you need to be able to run, test, and deploy with different configuration sets on the same machine. This is an uncommon strategy for mature production environments with teams, as you'll likely use an automated deployment setup in the cloud, but it is still useful in initial project stages. If you're doing local deployment but only have one set of configurations for both development and production, don't bother with .env flow. Just use the regular .env. So what else should be in your .git ignore? If you're using type B, local deployments. So if you're keeping secrets in your .env.production or .env.development, those files must be in your .git ignore. You do not want to be checking in secrets. Anything that would be unsafe for the world to access should be ignored. And how do other people on your team know what to put in their .env files? Well, so what happens when you have environment variables that you actually have values that you git ignored? Well, then you need to use what's called a .env template. So just say we don't want to check in .env.production. We'll make a copy of the file .production.template, and this will be checked in. You can either put a junk value, like an empty value, or you can put true, like you can put a default value, and then you check this into git, and you git ignore .env.production. So then what happens is that people have to make their own copy of the template, and then they would make their .env.production based on that. There's also some libraries that use .example instead of .template, but they're the same thing. Make sure to describe in your README all the variables, be nice to your team, document it, and make sure to describe step-by-step instructions on .env setup in your project README as well, because not everybody will understand what .env is and why it's awesome. One final topic before we move on is, do you need to validate your .env files? Well, if your .env files are git ignored, how do other teammates know what the types of the values should be? And if you add a new variable to your code, how do you make sure that others will add it to their local configuration files properly? You probably won't even know that they have to use it now. Well, there is a library called .env extended. I talk about that in the description. I don't think you need it though, because testing is not done on production servers. It's for development or automated testing tools where environment variables will not be set with .env files. What I recommend you do instead of .env validation is use the flow hierarchy to set the defaults. Explain your inputs clearly in your README. Use managed .env tools, which we'll be talking about later on. Communicate to your team when you make changes to the structures of your .env files. That's all for now. Have a great day.
Nice.
If you want to keep learning about how to build real-world apps with the latest technologies and other career-related topics, then start right now by subscribing to our channel and liking this video.